We need shelter and housing options.
As Washington State and the city of Seattle try to emerge from the COVID pandemic, some priorities are clear.
Beyond housing, we also urgently need more and better mental health and addiction treatment services.
And some advocates say an initiative to legalize magic mushrooms might be part of the solution.
People are desperate for more treatment options.
Another top issue, finding the right balance on police accountability.
Building that trust back is, I think, my number one concern.
And speaking of trust, Seattle is working hard this summer to avoid the state's redistricting fiasco.
There are some tough lessons that were learned there.
Want the inside scoop on the biggest news stories this summer?
The city has done months of outreach.
Don't miss our Journalist Roundtable.
Seattle Police now responds to thousands of calls that are not actually public safety calls.
It's pretty unsexy, but it got interesting this time around.
Going behind the headlines, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. The City of Seattle and our state legislature have been tackling some of the same issues in the first half of 2022, with varying results. Homelessness, a minimum wage for gig workers, and drug legalization, to name a few, are issues with deep connections in Seattle that are growing into larger statewide concerns. This week, for our season finale, we're looking at how city and state leaders are taking on these topics and more, a summer preview of what promises to be a tumultuous fall in local politics.
We need new units of housing, and I'm aggressively pursuing alternative shelter options.
Provide them supportive services and into shelter on a quick order.
You're not hearing an echo. City of Seattle and state leaders have been working towards some very similar goals in the first 6 months of this year. But are they on the same page?
2022 is going to be a little bit of a year of transition.
Seattle is now working with the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, which launched at the start of 2022, and with philanthropic help, aims to have shelter and housing for everyone living on the street in downtown Seattle by early 2023.
Every single person in Washington has a common denominator. We all need stable housing.
At the state level, despite a failed measure to increase so-called missing middle housing in the legislature, lawmakers this session did invest a record-breaking $800 million plus, largely from federal relief money, into homelessness services.
It's about the whole system.
On police reform, Seattle city leaders are balancing a push for public safety alternatives up against a flood of officers leaving the SPD. While state leaders have softened the police accountability legislation of the 2021 session, with officers claiming they were restricted from doing their jobs.
We see crime rising. We need to go back in and redo things over again.
Following a state measure passed this April, guaranteeing Uber and Lyft drivers a minimum wage, the city of Seattle is working on its pay up legislation to establish a minimum wage and other concessions from the app companies for tens of thousands of Seattle area residents doing work on all kinds of app-based platforms.
It's really important that that those workers get these protections.
While the homework was turned in late, it was completed.
One state process the city does not want to emulate is the state redistricting fiasco, with a missed deadline and other missteps that landed the state in federal court.
It's about making sure that the people who are more vulnerable in our communities can have a fair shot.
Under the watchful eye of neighborhood advocates, Seattle is working on setting new lines for its city council districts by this fall, in time for the 2023 elections, when 7 council seats will be up for grabs.
We're correcting and righting the historical wrongs of institutional oppression.
City Council President Deborah Juarez, who has led Seattle's work to improve data collection and services for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, has seen the state add to her efforts this spring. Lawmakers in Olympia have approved a new Amber Alert type system to raise awareness about Indigenous persons gone missing, which tribal members say is long overdue.
Families' cries for help are being heard, and also those that are missing and murdered, I feel like their cries for help are being heard here too.
And after a successful effort to decriminalize psychedelic drugs in Seattle, Advocates are hoping to get a measure on the statewide ballot this fall to legalize so-called magic mushrooms for the medical treatment of anxiety and depression.
I support the legalization of psilocybin in a safe therapeutic setting because we really need it. Mental health issues keep climbing, and whatever we can do to end the suffering would be my greatest wish.
Midway through 2022, we've seen a flurry of activity in city and state politics on similar policy discussions, setting up a busy fall with election season now just a few months away. And joining us to discuss these issues further, we have a journalist roundtable with us here. Jerry Cornfield is a political reporter for the Everett Herald. We also have Esmy Jimenez, a reporter who covers mental health issues for the Seattle Times, and Amy Radil, a reporter for KUOW. Thank you all for joining me here. And I want to start with public safety, always a big issue, especially now that we've heard about another tragic school shooting in Texas, a shooting motivated by racism in Buffalo. Amy, I wanted to start with you. Looking at gun violence more generally, it's been a growing problem in Seattle, too. And that's something our new police chief, whoever that might be, is going to have to respond to. Talk to us, please, if you could, about the search for a permanent chief this summer, and also this new plan from the council, the city council, to offer some hiring incentives with hundreds of officers leaving the SPD over the last couple of years.
That's right. So we have a selection committee for the new police chief. I think some of them are wondering how the mayor's encouragement of the interim chief, Adrian Diaz, to go for this position is going to affect the willingness of other candidates from around the country to step forward. But these committee members say, they're committed to trying to get a broad array of candidates for the city to ultimately choose from for our permanent chief. And then we've seen a change in tone by the city council, with a majority of members saying they want to look at some kinds of hiring incentives to attract new police officers. What they've done so far, I don't think will make a major change in the city's ability to hire. And I've talked to surrounding cities, including Everett, Jerry, and they've talked about how, they attract candidates with an array of things. Choosing where to work is a big decision. It's not just about, they don't think a cash incentive on its own is that big of a draw. And then the recruits themselves say that, Seattle has been used, fairly or not, as kind of a counterexample, where they've said, there's not as much community support for you as police officers in Seattle. So that's something that Seattle recruiters are going to have to try to overcome.
Yeah, right. And there's actually been a new position hired by the city council to help with recruiting for the SPD. So we'll see how that pans out. Thanks for that, Amy. Jerry, I want to head to you. You cover a lot of issues at our state capitol. We heard a lot of talk this past session about rolling back some of the police accountability measures that Olympia passed in 2021. We're also looking at a lot of open seats in the legislature up for election this fall. So I'm trying to figure out, what do you think the public safety messages we're going to hear from the candidates are? What's this debate on public safety? Where's it going?
Well, unfortunately, I think you're going to hear a debate that is, it's not going to be deep, and it's not going to be, it's going to be playing to folks' emotions and passions. I mean, public safety is a very personal thing. Either you do feel safe in your neighborhood, your home, your community, or you don't. The stories about acts of violence, gun-involved violence, are up everywhere in communities around Snohomish County, around the state. So I think the Republican side will be playing up the statistics. And on the other side, the Democrats are going to have to say, look, we have changed the rules for engagement between those in law enforcement and those of you on the street. And many folks never have an interaction with law enforcement, so they won't know what that means. But if they can be convinced that, look, the police are not going to use force when they arrive at the scene, and they are going to be more patient, then I think that they may be able to sway some voters to think that there is a change. I mean, it was 2 years ago, right, with George Floyd and his murder. And I think folks are still thinking about that in the urban areas. The more rural areas, that may not be on their mind.
Yeah, the anniversary of George Floyd's death 2 years ago this week. And thank you, Jerry, for covering that piece of it. Esmy, I wanted to go to you because you cover mental health issues for the Seattle Times, which has a lot of intersections with public safety. Can you talk about the rollout of this 988 system this summer? This is this new crisis hotline in our state. What is it? How's it going to work? How might it help?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially the idea is it's really hard to remember those 1-800 suicide lines. No one actually knows the full number for their county or city. So the idea is 988. You can call that if you or someone that you love or someone outside seems to be having a mental health crisis. You'll be able to talk to a counselor. They'll be able to provide, a way to de-escalate the situation. In the future, the idea is we could also dispatch a mobile crisis team. So someone would actually physically come to you and help you de-escalate that situation. And then from there, if someone really needed to be triaged because they had a higher level of need, they could actually be taken to a psychiatric hospital if necessary. So the idea is just, Seattle police now responds to thousands of calls that are not actually public safety calls. They are more psychiatric or mental health related calls, behavioral health calls. So the idea is let's make sure police are able to do the work that they want to do and are trained to do, as they are not social workers, they are not psychologists, they are not mental health counselors. And let's actually get the mental health counselors to the people that need that kind of help. So that's pretty much the goal there.
Yeah, a big part of the state discussion too, in terms of police accountability and how they should be involved. So thank you, Esmy, for that piece. Amy, I'll jump back to you I want to talk about homelessness here. Mayor Herald says it's not a victory lap, but he's certainly drawing attention to the city's work to clear a large encampment near Woodland Park in the past couple of weeks here. The process there took 4 months, but the mayor says it got results, referring more than 80 people into housing or shelter. I'm looking at Woodland Park, I guess, as a snapshot here. What does it say about the city's evolving response to homelessness and also the involvement of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority too?
Yeah, I mean, we saw the authority, standing with the city as the mayor talked about the outcome of, the work over the months with that encampment leading up to it being cleared. So that part seems harmonious. I think during the campaign, we were all wondering what Mayor Herald's approach really would be in terms of outreach, because he made it clear that he wanted to get encampments out of public spaces, but I didn't really know what that was going to look like. So far, in Ballard and Woodland Park, the city has done months of outreach. Most of the people in Woodland Park, it looks like, accepted referrals to the tiny house villages. So that seemed to be an option that worked out there, at least for now. We really need to follow what happens with these people longer term to really know what kinds of solutions are being found for them.
Right. And I know that by name list is a big part of it, which was a challenge in that situation there at Woodland Park, but something we're definitely going to keep on tracking. Esmy, let me jump to you here. So mental health, as we all know, a big part of the homelessness discussion in terms of services and treatment. You recently went to Arizona with some state leaders to see a mental health system that's getting some positive results. Talk to us about that and also maybe some of the challenges that homelessness brings to our state and local response to the crisis.
Oof, that's a big one. Arizona was interesting because it's a crisis system that's been developed for nearly 20 years now. They've really been working on getting it better and better and better. And it very much came after lots of lawsuits. So there's that. But the actual system there, there's immediate incentive for police to drop off people in crisis to the crisis centers. They do not take them to the ER. They do not take them to the jails. They have been trained very heavily to specifically go to crisis centers. And from there, the intake period is less than 10 minutes. Like, police are promised, if you come, we will prioritize you. We will take you immediately. You can return to your calls again, and we will deal with the person who's in crisis. And then those centers are also essentially built out so that someone can step down through their crisis. Most folks who are in crisis actually can, at least in Arizona, like 60% of them can step down within a day. So that means they sometimes only take 4 to 7 hours. They don't even need a full 23-hour period to step down and stabilize. And from there, they can get medication, they can get psychotherapy, they can get resources to the community and go into lower level acuity centers, essentially, again, just helping them come up with a plan how to return to work, to school, to their families. And one of the key things they do there is they don't turn people away. There's no such thing as, well, actually, this person has a violent record. Well, actually, this person also has meth use. Well, actually, this person really is having more behavioral health issues that are not really mental health related. Whereas here, you can go to Seattle centers and check in and look at the decline rates, and people will be turned away because they are too complex.
I was going to ask, though, the intersection with homelessness, when they interact with someone who's homeless, how does that work? Do they have a good answer there?
So they're also struggling with just housing prices in general. In terms of homelessness itself, the way that they've set it up is that they're trying to do like wraparound intensive services. Essentially, if someone also has homelessness as part of their background, then they bring in a different team to help with that. Is it a successful? Not as much as they would like it to be. They also have staffing issues, not as many workers as they can to help people through these systems, which is true here in Seattle as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Jerry, I want to go to you next. And we saw the state legislature invest more than $800 million into homelessness in this past session. But we're also seeing a number of cities come up with their own plans, too, that have raised a few eyebrows. Tell us about what's happening up in Edmonds with homeless encampments, how that could impact maybe what the state's trying to do here.
I think what's happening in Edmonds has also been seen in other states. I think California, there's a couple cities, and they've tried to they passed an ordinance that essentially says, if a person who's without shelter is offered shelter and services and says no, they could be fined or face arrest. At this point in time, there has to be shelter available and there has to be services available. So, and Edmonds doesn't have that. So they've created a situation for themselves where they're either going to be transporting people without shelter to other communities where there is shelter, or they're going to have to invest and use some of that money from the state when those grant dollars become available to build tiny home villages, to expand existing shelters, although there's none in the city, if I recall. But I think they're wrestling with, and this ordinance sort of points to what all communities are facing. What about the individual who's without shelter and doesn't want to take up any of the options that are offered? What then? And there's not a good answer to that. Unlike Seattle, for example, there's not a lot of attention being paid and a lot of energy being paid to clearing out encampments. We don't have, as we've seen elsewhere, it's a smaller audience they can work with.
Okay, smaller audience, but certainly the problem exists in many different cities. I know Mercer Island, Auburn also have some of those similar rules on the books there. So thank you for that, Jerry. Maybe I'll go back to you if I could, sir. Talk to us about redistricting. This one, well, I don't know if exciting is the right word, but Washington State now getting sued for its work on this process from earlier this year to redraw legislative district boundaries. What happened here and what's next? Some thoughts on this?
It's such a political process and it's pretty unsexy, but it got interesting this time around. Every 10 years it's interesting, but they got themselves behind the 8 ball, the 4 people, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, to redraw the boundaries of all the legislative and congressional districts. They had a tough task. They got themselves, and they ran out of time. And in the end, they didn't do what they needed to do. They're close. Supreme Court said good enough for us and let the lines be drawn. But the challenge is about what they did in those final hours and days, whether or not they were open and transparent enough. I mean, I don't think the outcome surprised many folks in terms of where the lines ended up, and the folks who are deep embedded in the political process, their voices, they knew what was going on. But the public, if you just turned into a meeting, you had no idea. You didn't see the maps they were drawing up. You didn't see where the lines were being moved. You needed a whiteboard and a pointer to say, okay, what we're doing. And that's what they're being sued over. In addition to a second suit, one of the legislative districts, there's a debate on whether or not majority minority is a term, whether or not there are enough voters there who are non-white, if they're fairly represented and have an opportunity to elect an individual who is not white. And it's a district that's been led by white male Republicans for quite a long time. So, but it may be a while before we get resolution of that.
Right. Yeah, some big issues in Central Washington on that one. Thank you, Jerry. Esmy, let me jump over to you because I wanted to draw on your experience covering immigration and elections to look at the process that Seattle is going through right now for the first time, redrawing its city council district line. So we got District 7, which covers downtown South Lake Union. It's booming. To keep all the districts the same size, which is the idea here, some lines are going to have to get shifted. How challenging do you think it'll be to create new maps that are equitable and also reflective of the big surge in people of color that have moved to Seattle in the past decade?
That's a great question. And I will totally admit this is not my area of expertise right now. I think what's interesting is, of course, that it's very hard to please as many parties, and that each, specifically when it comes to political parties, there's a reason why they're trying to make them be shaped a certain way, right? Everyone's trying to win. The interesting thing that struck me from Jerry's coverage and the coverage that I've seen at the Seattle Times is that the redistricting commission chair, at least on more of the state level, that there was the whole refusal to defend the maps. That to me was very interesting, at the point which the public can't actually trust the nonpartisan committees that are in charge of doing this kind of work. I think that becomes very dangerous. When I'm thinking too of Central Washington, I've covered that area. And so I remember at Yakima very, very early on, maybe like 2-4 years ago, I'm forgetting the time, some of the same issues actually led to the Washington Voting Rights Act, specifically because Yakima was saying, hey, we don't think we're being accurately represented at the city level, where Latino folks, Hispanic folks aren't, like, their vote is being diluted. So clearly this is something that is systemic, that's been going on for a couple of years, and I think we definitely need more answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amy, maybe some quick thoughts on what's happening with redistricting here. This is one of those situations where we have a nonpartisan group that's in charge of the Seattle process. I've talked to them a little bit. They're saying, we've looked at what happened at the state and we don't want a repeat of that. Some thoughts about what the city's going through right now.
Yeah, so I think public comment is being allowed right now so people can give input into the process to the Seattle group that's looking at various maps to, as you said, shrink the downtown district because there's been population growth there. And then my understanding is the farther north and south districts in Seattle are going to grow a little bit. And I did see a mention that Councilmember Sawant could be affected by this because some of the maps for District 3, where she represents, don't include her residents right now.
Yeah, that's going to be very, very interesting to see that one play out. Amy, thank you for that. I wondered if I could stay with you, Amy, and switch gears, talk about the pay up legislation the city council is working on right now to establish a minimum wage for app-based workers with some other protections too. Battle within the council over this. They've been working on this for a year plus. Some thoughts about what the city is trying to do here?
Yeah, I always think it's really interesting to see which areas Seattle is kind of trying to dive into that are sort of first in the nation. It looks like Seattle and New York are the two cities that are really trying to grapple with working conditions for app-based workers. Seattle already passed a law to give a minimum wage to the transportation network company workers, Uber and Lyft, a couple of years ago. Then the state caught up with them, passed its own law. So now that's been preempted. Now Seattle's forging into the delivery drivers area, people who work for DoorDash and Instacart. So their latest legislation would try to guarantee a minimum wage for those workers. And then it looks like we're going to see a whole suite of legislation where they take on what they see as kind of different areas, within kind of those working conditions. So this will be, going on for months, and it's been a pretty complex area.
Yeah, just the start of it. And we'll see how this plays out over the next several weeks with a full council vote. Thanks for that. Esmy, I want to jump to you and branch off completely different now for something completely different. A very interesting mental health debate happening at the state level. We've got signature gatherers out right now. They want to legalize psychedelic drugs, so-called magic mushrooms, for use in a clinical setting to deal with anxiety and depression cases, which we have seen skyrocket during the pandemic. Oregon voters approved this a few years ago. Do you think this has a shot in our state?
I think it'll certainly come back. So Senator Jesse Salomon tried actually passing it as a bill. It did not get any traction. It's very similar. The idea is, again, if you thought that you could benefit from the medicinal use of psilocybin, you could reach out, go to a DOH certified, a Department of Health certified clinic in the future and actually get treatment. You would first talk about what you're trying to do. You would actually go through the psilocybin trip experience, and then you would actually have a reintegration process where you talk about what you felt and saw so that you can kind of connect that back to your mental health treatment. I think it's certainly something that people are interested in, and more than that, I know therapists are getting ready for it. So I've seen a lot of therapists that are coming to Seattle and getting MDMA certified. We don't actually have the law yet, but MDMA federally might be the next drug that's approved for the treatment of depression, anxiety, or PTSD. So it's certainly something to look out for in the next coming months or years.
Okay, thank you for that. Jerry, I'm going to switch gears from psychedelia here, if I may, and stick back with elections here. Just had the filing deadline recently pass here. A lot of open seats in Olympia at the state level here. A few from the Seattle area here in terms of reps here. A number of people of color who've joined the state legislature recently are not running again. Plus, we're talking U.S. Senate elections, a lot to consider here. What are some of the big races that you're keeping an eye on?
I think you have the primary, which always has a few, it's got to narrow the field, and they'll be real interesting. I think the congressional district number 8, you have Representative Kim Schreier, facing, I don't remember, was it 8 or 10 opponents. And, again, redistricting, put a little bit of Snohomish County in her district. It's a very conservative part. And I think that conservative part could swing could make it difficult for her to hold her seat. You have a candidate, King County Council member Reagan Dunn. You have Jesse Jensen, who ran before against and barely lost. So it's going to be a very interesting race. Secretary of State, I think there's like 10 candidates there. You have the appointed seat holder, Secretary of State Steve Hobbs, a moderate Democrat. You have Pierce County Auditor running, the only election professional trying to run as nonpartisan, which is very hard for voters. They usually look for one party or the other. So she's going to have a hard time getting voters. And then you have several Republicans, including Mark Malosha, former state lawmaker, who's just stepped down as a leader of a very conservative organization, Family Policy Institute. You have State Senator Keith Wagner. So I'm watching that because I don't know who's going to emerge from that. Where will the voters go on that? I'm not as familiar with all the races in Seattle, but Democrat on Democrat in several districts is going to be money and a bunch of energy there. But overall, Democrats, they're concerned about losing seats, so they're on the defense statewide. And that'll be the big headline in November. How big is the Republican wave that they've been talking about on the East Coast, but doesn't always roll up as strong in Washington?
And we'll see how the abortion issue plays in a lot of these races too. That's another piece of it. Amy, I wanted to quickly touch on another issue at the state level, just approved by the legislature, a new program to alert people about missing and murdered Indigenous persons, a big issue in Seattle, which has more cases of Indigenous women killed or reported missing than any other city in the U.S. How's this program going to work?
Yeah, the State Patrol is still putting sort of the nuts and bolts in place on this, but it's going to take effect in July, and it's based on the silver alerts that can be issued for people, I think, over age 60 who are seen as, at risk in some way. And they say these alerts have been really effective in the past, the Amber Alerts as well for missing children. So it'll be great to see if this plays out in the same way. The State Patrol also needs kind of like a new software so that they can really make, have this new alert in their system and make it effective. So that's what I'll be watching there.
Yeah, just data collection, a big piece of that for sure. We need to start wrapping up here. Yeah,
Brian,
Jerry, you got something?
Because we've had a lot of coverage up on our paper. The Tulalip's, Isabella Breda has written quite a bit. One thing I picked up over the years is this issue and the alerts themselves. What it really does is increase education and information. I don't think a couple of years ago people ever talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women. Now it's front and center for law enforcement, for community leaders, for it's very important that it's there. And I think just knowing that, I think the way reports are handled are going to be totally different, and it's going to make a big difference.
Hope so. Hey, Jerry, 20-second version. What's something I haven't asked you about that you want to talk about? A headline you're looking at this summer.
Sound transit. I want to know what's going to happen with the so-called Seattle subway and whether the Seattle voters are going to tax themselves more to build that subway. They have the opportunity now.
Oh, we'll see how that goes. Esmy, same question to you. 20-second version, maybe a headline we haven't talked about today.
Western State and Eastern State Hospital, the two state psychiatric hospitals, are facing incredibly low levels of staffing. What will Washington do to actually make sure we are still taking care of the patients and the staff there?
Wow. Okay. A lot there for sure. Amy, I'll let you wrap up that idea we haven't talked about yet that you're looking at this summer.
Well, I've been following the fallout from the Blake decision by the Washington Supreme Court, where they threw out our felony drug possession law. And I just want people to know that records are being vacated. People's convictions are being vacated. They're getting started on that. They're sending people refunds for the fines that they paid. It's a little cumbersome. It's not perfect. And they haven't even started having to look at the microfiche that is where some of these older court records are stored. But the process is happening. So I think that's interesting.
Wow. Thank you all for all the work you do. Thanks for being with me, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about their top stories this summer? One person writes, Seattle needs to have entry-level apartments. How is everybody out here affording a $2,000 one-bedroom? Another group says, public safety means investing in basic needs and community-based crisis responders. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Well, we've come to the end of another season of City Inside Out. The production team will be taking a break, and we look forward to bringing you more timely, in-depth coverage in September. It's my honor to work with a great crew here at Seattle Channel. I'm Brian Callanan. Thanks for watching. Have a great summer.